BDS History, Morality and Future. The BDS campaign officially began in 2005 when representatives of Palestinian civil society called, quote, upon international civil society organisations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. And they asked that these measures, to quote again, be maintained until Israel meets its obligation to recognise the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law. So the BDS movement has emerged from this call on global civil society to employ boycotts as a particular tactic of resistance against occupation. And since we are here in an Institute of Higher Learning, it seems only appropriate that the papers of this BDS session today will focus on how academia might respond to this call. We know that the BDS has been controversial. It's been variously criticised for anti-Semitism, blocking dialogue, the peace process, much of other criticisms, some of which we'll hear about today. Academic boycotts in particular have been criticised for targeting the wrong people, violating basic principles of academic life, freedom, and dialogue. So today we have two speakers who will address the contested issues around BDS in academia and open up a dialogue about academic responsibility in relation to occupation. So to kick off our session, I would like to introduce Samah Sabawi, who is a Palestinian, Australian, Canadian writer, commentator, author and playwright. She's written and produced the plays Cries from the Land and Three Wishes. In 2014 she completed a sold-out season of her play Tales of a City by the Sea, which had an Arabic production by Al Rawad Theatre in Palestine and an English production by La Mama Theatre in Melbourne. Sabawi's essays and op-eds have appeared in various media outlets, including The Australian, Al Jazeera, The Globe and Mail, The Age, The Sydney Morning Herald. Her poetry has been featured in various magazines and books, most recently in an anthology entitled With Our Eyes Wide Open, Poems of the New American Century. And she's a policy advisor to the Palestinian Policy Network, Al-Shabaka, and a member of the Board of Directors of the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. And Samah is today presenting a paper entitled The Principle of Academic Freedom and the Obligations of Higher Learning Institutes, an examination of the arguments surrounding the academic boycott of Israel. So if you could join me in welcoming Samah.
Thank you for that and for the organizers of this worthwhile conference today. And I recognize that we are probably the most challenged here at the end of the day because the knafa was served. So hopefully it'll give you a sugar rush and you'll be able to focus with us and you'll not be feeling weighted down by it. Can you hear me in the back? So, inspired by the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel issued a call in 2004, urging academics and cultural workers around the world to boycott all Israeli academic and cultural institutions in support of the Palestinian people's struggle to end Israel's occupation, colonization, and system of apartheid. In the years that followed, the movement for an academic boycott of Israel spread throughout universities around the world. Jonathan Hahn, the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, called it one of the major geopolitical civil rights issues of our time. The debate around the academic boycott often centers on the concept of academic freedom on one side and the ethical and moral obligations of higher learning institutions on the other. In this presentation, I will be exploring this debate by closely examining some of the main arguments that are made against the boycott by leading academics and scholars and responding to these arguments. The first argument is that the academic boycott infringes on the basic principle of academic freedom and the ability of scholars to pursue their research freely. Now, I want you to think Gaza in 2014. During its 50-day bombardment of the city, Israel completely destroyed 26 schools and damaged 122 schools. 75 of them were UN-run schools. Hundreds of students were killed. Thousands of students and teachers were injured. Tens of thousands were made homeless, many are still homeless today. Hundreds of thousands were forever psychologically traumatized. Even that, and the daily restrictions on and the infringements on the rights of the Palestinian students, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. The question that I want you to think about is this: can we hold the value of academic freedom higher above the value of other basic human rights? Does the academic freedom of Israelis trump the pursuit of freedom, justice, and equality of the Palestinian people? The fact is, academic freedom cannot be seen apart from or as more important than other basic human rights, including the right to freedom of movement, so essential for education and yet so out of reach for millions of Palestinians. Every year, countless students get stranded in Gaza, unable to travel to universities abroad because Israel does not grant them the necessary permits that they need in order to be released from their big prison. Every day in the West Bank, students take on incredible journeys against all odds, crossing various Israeli checkpoints. Some make it with success to their schools and universities, others don't. The right to education and to freedom of movement is denied to the Palestinians by the very same system that the Israeli academics represent and benefit from. Still, it's important to clarify that the academic boycott targets institutions and not individuals. And what this means in practical terms is that Israeli academics are only affected by the boycott when pursuing academic cooperation and funding from institutions abroad while acting within an official capacity as representatives of an Israeli academic institution, or if their work or research is funded by an Israeli academic institution. So Israeli academics who are acting within their own personal capacity or as representatives of non-Israeli sponsored institutions are not subject to this boycott. What this means is that the academic boycott only causes Israeli academics the inconvenience of finding independent funding instead of relying on Israeli state or institutional funding, an inconvenience that pales by comparison to the hardships that the Palestinian academics and students face every day under Israel's brutal occupation. The next argument I wanted to address that I came across was put forward by American literary theorist and legal scholar Stanley Fish in an article that he published in the New York Times in 2013. In it, he makes the claim that academic freedom does not give scholars the right to be watching out for human rights violations and taking steps to stop them, insisting that doing so falls outside of the charge of the academy and the doctrine of academic freedom. Now, putting aside the fact that universities and higher learning institutions have historically been central to some of the world's most successful movements, including the anti-war movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and the civil rights movement in the US. Now, putting all of that aside, to even consider this view by Fish is highly problematic because it attempts to limit the definition of academic freedom and to separate and isolate it from human rights and social justice issues that are taking place outside the walls of higher learning institutions. Students and academics do not live in a high tower or in a bubble. This promotion of a culture of apathy can only benefit authoritarian, militaristic governments. Such promotion of apathy may explain the silence of Israeli academics, who have for a long time acted as though they are bystanders to the conflict. I'm reminded here of an article that Ned Gordon wrote in the Chronicle Review. In it, Gordon offers a very vivid account of his days as a student of philosophy in Israel, in Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in the late 1980s. He describes sitting in class while the first Palestinian uprising was raging in the street in Arab East Jerusalem. He remembers hearing gunshots and seeing the cloud of tear gas in the valley below where the Israeli army tried to crush the unarmed protesters with absolute brutality, while students continued to sit in their classes as the entire tragedy was unfolding outside their windows, as if they had nothing to do with it. Gordon wrote, "While the Palestinians fought for their liberation, we continued our classes on Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and G.E. Moore." And while on the subject of silence and apathy, It is worth noting that not one Israeli university has ever passed a resolution protesting Israel's assault on Palestinian education and academic freedom. The late Israeli academic Tanya Reinhardt, former professor of linguistics at Tel Aviv University, highlighted this collective silence on the part of Israel's academia when it comes to the way Israel sabotages Palestinian education. And she made the point that in extreme situations of violations of human rights and moral principles, if an academic institution remains silent, then it collaborates with the oppressing system. End quote. She was right, but silence seems to be exactly what the pro-Israel establishment prefers. I came across the writings of two Oxford professors when I was doing this research, David Rubin and Michael Yotkin. They took the trouble to put together an essay expressing their opposition to the academic boycott, which was published in the Journal of Political Philosophy. Now, part of their argument rested on the claim that academics should not be a target for boycotts because they lack sufficient political power to instigate change. They explained that academics are not critical to the survival of the regimes, like others in trade, armaments, and finance, and therefore they cannot pressure the regime into changing, so why the academic boycott? Now, it doesn't take much research to recognize that this logic is flawed. Israel's academic institutions are very powerful. They provide the state with the military training, the science and weapons technology, and the strategic planning that in effect maintains the system of occupation and subjugation of the Palestinian people. Tel Aviv University is built in part on land belonging to a Palestinian village once destroyed by Israel in 1948. It plays a significant role in developing technological support for the Israeli military and arms industry, and it is home to the Institute for National Security Studies, a military planning center. Israel's leading institute for scientific research, Tribunal, is known for designing military weapons and for its partnership with Elbit Systems, Israel's largest private weapons manufacturer. Hebrew University in Jerusalem expands over 800 acres of illegally acquired land that belongs to private Palestinian owners. Bar Ilan University has set up a campus inside an illegal settlement in the West Bank. Haifa University sponsors scholarships for Army veterans, and in 2010 it won an Israeli Army tender to train students at the Army's College for National Security for MA studies. During last year's savage and merciless Israeli bombardment of Gaza, Hebrew University collected donations earmarked for Protective Edge, scholarships that were a reference to the Operation Protective Edge, the name that Israel gave to its military assault, which saw 2/3 of Gaza turned to rubble, and in which Israel, according to many reputable human rights groups, has committed war crimes. In October last year, weapons giant Lockheed Martin signed a research collaboration agreement with the Yisroel Research and Development Company, a technology transfer company that belongs to the university. Now, based on these links and many more links, an argument can be made that academic institutions in Israel support and maintain the ideological apparatus that maintains Israel's system of oppression and discrimination. This renders the argument made by Rubin and Yotkin in regards to the lack of power academic institutions have as inaccurate. Still, many liberal Zionists especially insist that the boycotts are counterproductive because they weaken academics who are often amongst the most liberal voices within their society, and they interfere with their ability to express their opposition to the status quo, and that change is more likely to come through dialogue and collaboration than through the boycotts. But let's be frank. Even though so-called liberal Israeli academics and institutions have close ties to the state, they receive funding, and in return they provide the state with the scientific, commercial, and intellectual basis which enables the state of Israel to entrench its control of the people that it occupies. And while there may be a small number of liberal Israeli academics that do voice criticism of Israeli policy, the greater majority of them don't. As for the virtue of collaboration and dialogue, we only need to look at the past several decades. Yes, there was a time when a great number of Palestinians did engage with Israelis in countless dialogue initiatives, which sprung in the aftermath of the announcement of the Oslo peace process in 1993. So many, they became known as the peace industry. Within this industry, countless opportunities were given to those who participated, ranging from financial gains and overinflated funding for peace projects, with all the perks of fun trips abroad and accommodations in fancy hotels. But after 2 decades, none of these initiatives produced any changes on the ground. The settlements continued to expand, the Palestinian state continued to shrink, the negotiations in the peace process fell apart, and now we're at a point where Israeli officials have seen to it that there is no hope of a Palestinian state. The reason the peace process and the peace industry failed is very much the same. Both rested on a morally flawed premise of equal partnership, and the idea that the reason the conflict persists is mutual hatred. And so all that we needed to end this conflict was to have a big group hug, after which we would all live happily ever after. But the conflict is not between two equal partners who hate each other and need measurements to build trust. This is Oslo language. This is a colonial conflict between an occupied people and those who occupy them. The only way to end this conflict is through stopping the oppression and restoring justice. We need to co-struggle together in order to coexist in peace, not to normalize the inequality and the oppression that defines and characterizes our current relationship. Now, next on the list of popular arguments, and it's one that we've heard a million times, but I will still entertain it. Why are we singling out Israel for this boycott? Now, supporters for Israel have for a very long time objected to the academic and the other forms of boycotts because they say Israel is not the worst human rights offender in the world. So why are we singling it out? Of course, this question is often designed to shift the focus and the conversation away from Israel's violations and to direct it instead to the possible motives of those who are supposedly singling Israel out, accusing them of anti-Semitism and hypocrisy, etc. But in any case, I will still answer to that one. First of all, the worst first rule was never a criteria for boycotts before in any other case. As George Bishart, a Palestinian American academic, has said, and he has argued in a piece that he wrote in 2008, he said, if we were to apply the worst first standard, then the Pol Pot regime would have been a better candidate for boycotts than apartheid in South Africa. But a boycott would not have worked with Cambodia because its ties to the West were not strong enough to make a boycott effective. The same could not be said of South Africa during its apartheid era or Israel today. South Africa's strong ties to the West meant that the boycott would be effective. Israel has very deep ties with Western culture and economy, and so a boycott against Israel can be very effective to pressure it to cease its violations of Palestinian human rights. Now, let's not ignore that without the complacent support of the Western governments and their unprecedented acceptance and even promotion of Israeli exceptionalism, Israel would not be able to sustain its occupation and its flagrant violations of humanitarian international law. And then another important point to make here is that the Palestinian civil society has asked for the boycott as a nonviolent tactic to bring change to a horrible status quo. Who else were they supposed to ask us to boycott? Bolivia? Who else occupies and oppresses them? There is hypocrisy in this claim that Israel is unfairly being singled out. Palestinians are always asked to embrace nonviolent resistance. Yet when Palestinian civil society asks for a nonviolent and effective way to end the occupation and the oppression, its motives are questioned. What else would you have the Palestinians do when all other means have failed? The final argument I will address today is the one that claims that boycotts create an unhealthy environment that could stifle the process of free speech. Now let's begin with the assumption embedded in this claim. The assumption being that there is a healthy environment of free speech which exists on university campuses, and that this environment needs to be protected, really. Here I'd like to mention an article by Delenda C. Hanley, last year, news editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. She detailed in an article just how the pro-Israel groups stand with us, along with pro-Israel college alumni and donors, launched a campaign to pressure the U.S. college presidents to take a stand against the American Studies Association for supporting the academic boycott, calling on them to withdraw their membership and publicly denounce the organization. According to Hanley, 134 members of the House of Representatives in the U.S. denounced the ASA vote, and a New York State senator introduced new legislation that would ban funding to any academic institution that is affiliated with the ASA. Now, this mounting pressure caused more than 200 university presidents to condemn the ASA vote without seeking input from members of their faculty. So much for academic institutions being a bastion for open debate. The reality is the tactic of silencing debate is a common feature on many campuses when it comes to criticism of Israel. It was evident when, even though the British Medical Journal voted against the boycott, they were still subjected to attacks by pro-Israel groups. The reason? Because they dared to allow the debate to happen in the first place. According to the editor of the British Medical Journal, Fiona Godley, the overwhelming responses the BMJ received were not focused on the merit of the boycotts or the academic freedom or any of that. Rather, they were just really angry and critical because the debate was allowed to take place. So those who spoke against the academic boycott, while often citing academic freedom, were the ones most determined to silence the academic debate on this issue. So much so they accused anyone of allowing the debate to take place as being on the side of the other, which, according to Godley, is a first in any kind of debates. Now, more recently, the UK High Court upheld a decision by the University of Southampton not to allow an academic conference on Palestine-Israel to take place at the university because of what they refer to as a health and safety issue. The real reason, of course, is because Zionist groups intimidated and threatened their way to ensure the conference would be cancelled. Now I'm just going to have to pause track a little bit. Now, this pressure that is felt on academic institutions in many Western nations, I recommend that you read the work of Marcy Jane Newman, Associate Professor of English at An-Najah University in Palestine, who points in her work at the existing censorship within the academic institutions in the US that led to at least two professors, Dr. Norman Finkelstein of DePaul University and Joseph Massad of Columbia University, to suffer great consequences and lose their jobs for criticizing Israel in their research. Now, Knopf Newman calls on academics to rethink the notion of academic freedom and to see it more as a privilege rather than a right, in order to foster a constructive debate within academic institutions and to promote a healthy environment to conduct research and express dissent freely. In conclusion, when we look at all the arguments made against the academic boycott, it becomes clear that the underlying theme is a request at inaction. Its issuers often offer no other recourse to change a brutal status quo that must be changed. Academics, as do all of us, have a moral responsibility to refuse collaboration with those who violate or are part of a system that violates the human rights of others. I'd like to end with a quote by Alex Rubin, a member of the American Studies Association, who wrote to the nation explaining why he chose to vote for the academic boycott. He wrote, "Academic freedom means very little when it takes place in a context of segregation and apartheid. Change came to the Jim Crow South not through academic dialogue, but through protest and, in some cases, through boycotts of the institutions that fostered segregation. Change came to South Africa's apartheid system not through academic dialogue, but through protest, resistance, and an international boycott. Those of us who value academic freedom must always struggle to ensure that the world surrounding academia provides the basic human rights that enable academic life." Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Samah. So who's going to pick up on this, the theme of responsibility that I was talking about there at the end. Peter is an associate professor in philosophy here at the University of New South Wales. He's co-founder of Independent Australian Jewish Voices and an executive member of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network. And his paper today is entitled Resisting the Occupation, Responsibility of Intellectuals and Academia.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to mainly read this, but I can't quite do a talk without some PowerPoint slides, but there's some that I really want to refer to. I've got very few, but I'll get back to those. Samah referred to the silence of academics, and it's my theme too in a slightly different way. I want to refer not only, of course, to the ones that Samah referred to directly complicit, for example, in the universities in Israel, where they're involved in elder production or whatever. I've got a slightly different focus. I want to talk in relation to the silence about a special kind of resistance that's appropriate for academics, intellectuals, and this is a theme that I want to develop. But before I get on to it, I just wanted to say one brief word or two about BDS, which I'm not going to talk about. There was a forum at Sydney University a week or two ago, which I did speak at, and particularly the topic then was whether BDS was anti-Semitic. That's the usual accusation which someone can take up, and I'm not going to go into it here. But I just wanted to mention it in this context that there's a danger in getting into these debates about whether BDS is anti-Semitic or whether its proponents are anti-Semitic. It's a distraction from the real issues. We end up defending ourselves and our integrity and our psychology and whether we're self-hating and a whole lot of other nonsense. And it's a trick because it stops us talking about what I think are really important issues. So I can't resist mentioning, of course, as far as BDS goes, it's just on Twitter today. The state of Tennessee voted against BDS. The state of Tennessee also voted creation science mandated for teaching in the high schools, and the guy who's promoting it thinks that Obama is to blame for the tornadoes. So that tells you the credibility of that. So they shouldn't be too bragging about the state of Tennessee being against BDS. All right. Look, generally, as I'm suggesting on occasions such as this one, I really prefer to speak directly about the so-called facts on the ground as well. The grim realities of what's happening in Palestine, because they're insufficiently known to a degree that's really quite extraordinary. That's something I'm going to emphasise. This audience is probably not typical, but I'm surprised at the sophisticated, educated people who know so little about what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. And a visit by Amira Haas is very important for somebody who sees it and knows it and can speak with authority about it. So that's why this is a very important thing to be doing. So. But I'm not going to do that, as I do often. I can't resist just as reeling off a few of the relevant things, which I'll come back to. They've been referred to today. I mean, you know, the number of Palestinian unarmed kids that are shot dead on the West Bank, I think it's averaging 2 a week. I said that to a Jewish man the other night, and he didn't believe me, so I had to give him the references. He was shocked, rightly shocked. It's not known. The fact he's shocked is itself very significant. And there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. The number of house demolitions, the uprooted trees, the water, all of that. And of course, Gaza is a whole different story. I'm not going to talk about that, but I kind of feel inclined to. I should say another thing that's sort of obvious. I'll mention this perhaps in my summing up. It's an unusual occasion for me. I'm normally talking at activist meetings, and I'm an activist, not an academic expert in the law. And so I'm very pleased to be here on this occasion, but I want to talk about things that are not, as it were, legal issues as such. It's coming from a different perspective. So for the reason that the realities are so little known, it's important to address this very phenomenon that I'm referring to and its causes. And this is, of course, what Noam Chomsky and Herman have referred to back in 1979 in this book as what they call the gap between fact and belief that has become a yawning chasm. They were talking about all sorts of events around the world. This book is a kind of compendium of horrors and terror around the world, state-sponsored terror, not the kind of terror which we had an interesting discussion about by Ben Saul earlier, and how it's defined to be, you know, the reactive terror, not of state players. It's now since September 11 defined that way, apparently. But this is about the largely US-sponsored terror around the world, the nightmare but particularly their concern, which is not understood by their critics, is with ourselves. My topic tonight is not so much about what's going on over there, but about us. That's the issue of universities and intellectuals and academics. They refer to, in terms that become very well known from Chomsky, the necessary illusions achieved through the manufacture of consent. These are the mechanisms of thought control in our own liberal democratic society with a free press and with a free university. We have these illusions, myths about ourselves as being immune from brainwashing and propaganda. That's the trick. And that's what Chomsky's devoted his life since 1960s during the Vietnam War to exposing. And that's why I'm going to be really doing pretty much a kind of a textual exegesis of Chomsky, who's the great, my former student Michael is smiling because he knows I can't go too far, but this is an important case. Chomsky really is a very important source looking at what goes on around the world in this specific respect, and what is so badly misunderstood is concerned with our culture. Now, in that regard, and he uses a special term. The concern is with the ideological institutions, the press, the schools, and particularly universities. And these, he says, are faced with a special challenge, which I'm concerned with. This is our challenge to engage in a certain special form of resistance. The topic of the Symposium is resistance. And I'm talking about a special form of resistance. But this is what Chomsky is referred to as intellectual self-defense. We have to learn how to defend ourselves against the barrage of misinformation. That's a form of resistance which we might think. Now, of course, the topic is quite general, and I'm drawing, as I say, on Chomsky's writing, especially since the Vietnam War, and in particular, his extraordinary essays, which I've been rereading, and I'm getting my students to read, in a little book, which is kind of like the Old Testament I carry around, American Power of the New Mandarins, the essays written during the Vietnam War, which are eloquent, powerful indictments of the US and the intellectual class in particular who supported it at universities and elsewhere. So, now, not only Chomsky, in following Chomsky, I'm also following the style of writing and the themes of Edward Said, who in his Orientalism and covering Islam also is concerned with the way our culture, our art, and literature are all conditioned by certain prejudices and biases. And I won't give a sort of full-blown lecture on this, on Orientalism and so on. I need to try and get through my talk. But Chomsky says something that makes the significance of this concern clear. He says, a fact that must colour any discussion of contemporary institutions like our universities is that the level of culture that can be achieved, the level of culture that we achieve in our society and in our universities, is a life and death matter for large masses of suffering humanity. That's why my topic is an important one, because what we do and what we don't do, and the silence that I'm going to be talking about so much, that has life and death consequences, in this case, in Palestine. And one of the interesting things for me, because I spend quite a lot of my time thinking and writing about it, not only in politics but in linguistics, Chomsky's work in language is very interestingly parallel. If it were not for the fact that Chomsky's entire vast output of political writing since the 1960s has been a concern with, quote, the American system of thought control and indoctrination, unquote, the difficulty of comprehending Chomsky's projects is remarkable. They just don't get it. And in a way, that's a kind of evidence of how deeply entrenched these biases are. People can't see it. I'm going to give you some funny quotes from Chomsky to show how difficult it is for people to comprehend this issue. Chomsky explains, our concern in this book has been to inquire into the relation between the image and the reality, the distribution of concerns, framing of issues, filtering of information, emphasis and tone, and by keeping debate within the bounds of acceptable premises. He thinks that in our media, the ABC or the BBC, they function in a certain way to prevent us from thinking outside the bounds of certain constraints. We think, oh, we have robust debate. That's the trick. The debate is kept carefully within certain bounds and certain premises are never questioned. So I won't give the full-blown version of this. But he says, and this is one of the important themes, the primary targets of the manufacture of consent are those who regard themselves as, quote, the more thoughtful members of the community, the intellectuals, the opinion leaders, and of course us at universities in particular. So that's a bit of... People don't like to think that they're duped, especially if they're smart and educated. And that's the problem. Now, in relation to Palestine, in connection with this, we've had really an interesting discussion about warfare. Both sides of it, the ones that like it, the ones that don't like it. An interesting aspect of this, which is related directly to Palestine, is the Bertrand Russell Tribunal on Palestine, which was held recently and was completely ignored, as far as I can see, in the mainstream media. It's another example of important concerns, in this case legal concerns, but they have another dimension, which is not just a legal dimension. The tribunal said that it will affirm the supremacy of international law as the basis for a solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, it goes on to say, the failure to carry through effectively on the Goldstone report, for example, notwithstanding Goldstone's apostasy, it has shown that the efforts to take action in response to clear breaches of international law are thwarted through political interests. Well, that's what we heard earlier today. The international is fine, but it's not helping enough. And the tribunal tries to raise awareness of this. Now, of course, this goes back again to the 60s, because I still have in a little book of Bertrand Russell on the War Crimes Tribunal, a little newspaper clipping of Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre, the people who held the original Russell Tribunal, concerning the war crimes in Vietnam by the United States. And again, picking up on exactly the thing that Samah mentioned, Russell said, may this tribunal, I think in introducing it at the opening, he said, may this tribunal prevent the crime of silence. Now, as I say, this is a theme that is in some ways even difficult to talk about. Of course, they cited Nuremberg as the basis, the crimes that were brought in, the challenges that were brought against many Germans to be hanged. And of course, the quote, I won't go through the details, but some of you may know, the chief prosecutor, the American prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials, Justice Jackson, he said that if they're crimes if the Germans do it, they're crimes if we do it. And that's an important insight today. And that's the problem we're facing. Of course, again, the Russell Tribunal then was ignored by the public in the United States, like the Tribunal of Palestine. So it's about our responsibility. And it's, as Russell said, it's in the United States, and of course here, the trial and the book on it can find its most important effects. And I think this is a quote from Russell. He says, the record of the tribunal stands as an eloquent and dramatic appeal to renounce the crimes of silence. The crime was compounded by the silence that breeded its detailed documentation and careful studies. Okay. Chomsky, in the introduction to the tribunal, says, I'll just again quote him because it makes the points more eloquently than I can. He says, it's the fundamental duty of the citizen to resist and restrain the violence of the state. This is the resistance that we're talking about, and this is the citizens' responsibility, us, here in this country. Those who choose to disregard this responsibility can justly be accused of complicity in war crimes, which itself is designated as a crime under international law, apparently, in the principles of the Charter of Nuremberg. I can't help at this point, of course, part of my role, I guess, silence about this is more culpable in some cases than others, and the Jewish community, in particular, has a special responsibility in relation to the crimes of the State of Israel. And their silence is, I think, in some relevant respects, much more serious. Let me go ahead. Now, here's something that I will want to use the slides for. As it happens, I'm watching a lot of this stuff, and I watched a talk by Mikko Peled recently, very recently in the United States, where Amira's colleague, Levy, also spoke. But Peled said something which I've been asking practically every time I speak, and so I'm going to show a couple of pictures which may be less relevant to this audience. But he asked an interesting question. He said, about Gaza. He said, how could the world watch with equanimity the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza? He says, and have no moral qualms. He mentioned Israel in particular, watch the helicopters, he says, going overhead while they're on the beach in Tel Aviv and doing their devastation. He's left speechless and hard to comprehend how this is possible. That's the concern that I have as well. And this is where it also goes back to Vietnam. And I want to make a comparison, which I find very moving and very shocking, really. After a gruesome, harrowing account of some of the suffering and immense quantities of ordnance, the bombing in Vietnam, in one of his essays, Chomsky says, I quote, with no further information than this, just the amount of bombs dropped on Vietnam, which exceeded the amount of bombs dropped in the whole of the Second World War, apparently. He says, with no further information than this, a person who has not lost his senses must realize that the war is an overwhelming atrocity. That's before you've heard all the detail. I want to show you some slides, because it sort of explains the reaction. These are the other slides I would have shown. Now, some of you may have seen this. That's Shujaia. I can't get over the kind of morbid fascination watching. This was a civilian residential suburb. I tweeted this and it got 3,000 retweets. And I had some comment. This was Tel Aviv. That stopped it immediately. But it's Gaza. Nobody cares. These are the shots that are coming out of Gaza. I've been showing this to politicians in Canberra. Their jaws drop. Now, these are supposed to be informed people who make pictures to Canberra, and they look at this and they can't believe it. How come they've never seen it? I mean, these are like, they're certainly not on the evening news. They're not in the Sydney Morning Herald. It's a great photo. These are extraordinary pictures. Well, that's the relevance. I'll come back to that slide in a second. How am I going for time? Okay. attention to. Chomsky writes, he gives an example during the Vietnam. And the parallel is for me extremely interesting because when you're reading about Vietnam, it's so distant, you kind of shake your head with horror. But we're going through what I think is the same moral and intellectual crisis. I'll just read it out. I haven't got the full text here. I'll explain. He explains that in a supermarket or in some shopping mall or somewhere in the United States, there was a game set up in those days. It weren't electronic. There was some shooting game, and kids could get a gun, and there was some little model of a Vietnamese village, and there were little characters in here in their black pajamas, the way the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese were. These are the South Vietnamese, not North Vietnamese, and they were. Well, he explains it, but I'll just read this quote. He says, "What can one say about it?" Although shooting, of course, kids can shoot at these little Vietnamese running around. He says, "What can one say about a country where a museum of science in a great city," I thought it was a supermarket, it's a museum of science in a great city, "can feature an exhibit in which people fire machine guns from a helicopter at Vietnamese huts with the light flashing when a hit is scored? What can say about a country where such an idea can be even considered?" He says, "You have to weep for this country." That's the kind of emotional response that Chomsky had, and he tries to wake us up. Let me show you a game which I've found recently, which is striking in its analogy. I came across this accidentally. Online, somebody showed there's a game you can play online. I don't know if you've seen this. Bomb Gaza. This is for your kids. It's too revolting for words, but that's the parallel is very extraordinary. A couple of screens from that game. Well, I'll just read what Chomsky goes on to say. And I don't think things got better since then. He says, "These and 1,000 other examples testify to a moral degeneration on such a scale that talk about the normal channels of political action and protest and resistance that we talked about." He says, "They become meaningless and hypocritical." He says, "We have to ask ourselves whether what is needed in the United States is dissent, resistance, or," he says, "denazification." It's a pretty strong thing to say. He says, "What is more, there is no powerful outside force that can call us to account. The change will have to come from within." That's from the American Carol and the New Mandarins in the 1960s. I'll wind up in a second, but I've got a couple more things I want to say. Can I have a couple more minutes? And he does talk about, of course, schools and what we could do. I've said perhaps enough about that, but he says one response to this is that the universities and schools might attempt to offer students some means to defend themselves from the onslaught of the massive government propaganda apparatus and from the natural bias of the mass media and from the equally natural tendency of significant segments of the intellectual community to offer their allegiance not to truth and justice, but to power and the effective exercise of power. That's what academics do, if only by their silence, if not by, and maybe by their silence. And one of the most egregious symptoms of the delusion and the thought control and the manufacture of consent among Israelis, Jewish communities and the wider society is one of the most striking things that I have trouble comprehending in the ways that these things are hard to comprehend, is the reversal of reality, according to which Israelis and Jews think of themselves as the victims. Now, if you've dealt with Israelis or Jews in the community, you will know that this is, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I have enough discussions with those Jews that simply talk to me, fewer and fewer in number. And Gideon Levy, I'm quoting Gideon Levy in the speech that I've already mentioned, he says the following: "We have to face reality. And the reality is that there is no chance for a change within the Israeli society," just as Chomsky said, the only place to go, but Gideon Levy thinks in Israel there's no chance. He says the only hope is for an international intervention, and the only hope is from this place, from Washington and from Sydney and Canberra. Because Israeli society is today far too brainwashed. Life in Israel is far too good. I mean, in Tel Aviv it's like in, Double Bay. He says, Israel is, let's face it, a society which lives in a denial, totally disconnected from reality. And he says, if it was a private person or an individual, he'd recommend either medication or hospitalisation. That's a joke, but it's a serious joke on the psychopathology of a kind of denial which I'm facing enough when I have discussions with people who have no idea. Let me wind up. I've got a couple more things I don't think I need to elaborate too much. I mentioned Socrates, but I'll spare the rest of it. Chomsky says that he finds what I'm talking about is not so much disagreement as an inability to hear. And I'll quote him because if you have these arguments, it's quite an extraordinary phenomenon to have this discussion with people I've grown up with. I mean, I'm talking about people that I've grown up with and spent my whole life and often seen every week. And here's a quote from Chomsky. He says, "There's a complicated system of illusions and self-deception that are the given framework for most discussion and debate. And if you don't happen to take part in that system of illusions and self-deception, what you say is incomprehensible to them." I've got a wonderful quote here. So, he says, "The sign of a truly totalitarian culture," and the thought control, "is that important truths, truisms, like, you know, all human beings have equal rights. Maybe the Palestinians have equal rights." I've had an interesting discussion with Ahmed here, who spoke with one of the leaders of the Jewish community. I won't name him. But he wasn't willing to concede that he was willing to concede everything. One state, I'm quoting, and this leader of the Jewish community wasn't willing to concede equal rights to Ahmed. This is a guy who was in Australia, he's not an Israeli. You know, what? I don't even know where to start. We're left speechless. So Chomsky says, "The sign of a truly totalitarian culture is that important truths simply lack cognitive meaning and are interpretable only at the level of fuck you." That's Chomsky's quote. So when you say, you know, moral truisms, that's how they hear it. And of course, this symposium is a good example. I'll get back to that when I do my summary. And then of course, which you know, then they will, of course, it will elicit from them a perfectly predictable torrent of abuse in response to it. Okay. And it's only partly successful. This tactic is partly successful because members of the public pose the constant risk of thinking for themselves, as Orwell recognised when he spoke of the same problem of nationalism. In another context, I was going to speak about, in another conference, I have to say, I can't just tell you, it was a Jewish conference, I've been banned from it. I was going to talk about Hannah Arendt, and I was going to talk about the problem, which is this same problem of nationalism. She was charged with not having enough, what's called Ahavat Israel, which is the love of the Jewish people. I'm going to talk about that, but that's taboo. But the risk that they're clearly aware of is that some people may start thinking for themselves. And that's why the tactic of vilification is only partly successful. Orwell recognised this when speaking of nationalism. He remarked, "One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool." Famous quote. Look, I've got some more to say, but I think I'll wind up and I'll come back and maybe if I've got anything to say, come back later. Thank you very much.
Both to Peter and Samah. So we have maybe 10 minutes for questions, and then Peter's going to sum up for that. So I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and as we have been doing over the course of the day. So we have a question here.
Peter, you were talking about a disconnect from reality when you showed those photos of the devastation of Gaza. What you didn't mention in the reality of it all is the multiple rocket launchers that are put in homes, taken the roots, that open and close. They fire at civilian populations. Let me finish. I haven't finished my question. So, if I can talk, what can I just speak for a minute? The rockets and missiles that are fired at Israeli civilian population centres from next to hospitals and schools. So what do you expect? You expect the population there to sit back and take it?
Well, I'll tell you what I expect.
Homes in Gaza have all but one room, most of them have one room where the roof opens. The roof closes. The rocket launchers go and they're shut. So
I'll tell you what I expect. First of all, the international lawyers here made the point. Ben Saul made it earlier today.
Am I telling the truth or not here?
No.
I'm going to show you something. Let me say something on another
You might watch out for being hit by a car or a rocket in Ashdod.
I'll say a couple of things. Firstly, the international lawyers here will confirm my understanding, is that even if the extent to which, and I understand it's probably true, the Gazans may fight with their rockets from civilian areas, it's still a war crime to fire and devastate civilians, even if they're allegedly sitting behind their children when they shoot. And I don't know the extent of it. It's a war crime.
What about the phone calls?
Now, wait, one other answer. Let me answer. You said your thing. Let me say my thing about the rockets. I've shown this to, again, politicians in Canberra, in fact, including the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, at the time of 2008-9, the cast-led invasion. The fact of the matter is, and you can check this, the ceasefire in June of 2008 was observed by Hamas. It was a couple of other pissy rockets were being set off. They weren't a danger to anybody. I've got a picture of the holes they made. But this is the important point. That then and now, but this was a clearer case for a reason I'll show you. Hamas honoured the ceasefire. And in November the 4th, Israel violated the ceasefire and the rockets started up. And when I said this to then Minister Stephen Smith and other foreign ministers since I've spoken to them, they're sort of outraged. What about all the rockets? I said, oh no, they said, how do you know? Here's how I know. It's on the Israeli Foreign Ministry website. It was. This was a screenshot of the foreign website. It was taken down. The rockets stopped in June 2008, essentially. That's the picture. I didn't make this up. And then the rockets started again. Now, the citizens in Sderot were protected by the ceasefire, and Israel, this time and on every other occasion, is the one, if you look at the timeline. Now, we could argue about this because I know this is controversial, but now I'm presenting you an alternative account, a narrative, which is not the one that the media tell you. Every journalist gets up and say, what if rockets were coming from, Bellevue Hill to Kensington? Okay. Well, there's a whole story about the rockets and how dangerous they are, and that's why those pictures are relevant. Even if there was some, and there's some danger obviously to Israelis, I'm not minimising the danger. I'm saying we should be realistic about what's going on, and you don't devastate the whole of Gaza, because the protection for the Israeli citizens is to negotiate. They assassinated that guy who was at the last thing. Gershon Baskin had he was explaining how he was doing back-channel negotiations. There's a whole story. Amira knows this better than anybody. She can tell you about the attempts. Even Hamas, as crazy as they are, and I don't fully know, they've made what Sarah Roy, the world's expert on Gaza, regards as serious, pragmatic attempts to negotiate on the internationally agreed solution. Well, that's the solution to the rockets for Israel.
Okay, so we'll take 3 questions in a row, and then get the speakers to respond to them. So, Amira?
2 questions. One to you. You say that the academic boycott doesn't cause more than inconvenience to academics. Is that what you want, only inconvenience?
No, I said at the...
So, yeah, so I want to continue. My impression there is that, especially the academic boycott, gains a lot thanks to the attacks against you. Because in practice, it is not more than symbolic or tokenistic. Because it's very nice for all these Americans to declare that they are for the boycott, but then they use the computers that are being produced with cooperation with Israeli company. So I feel that there is a lot of, if you were not attacked, nobody would have noticed the academic boycott. And to you, and the question to Peter, how do you plan to achieve more, or how do you expect that people today will react differently to atrocities of superpowers such as Israel, differently than how they reacted to American atrocities in Vietnam?
My question is, Norman Finkelstein opposes the yes, as I think Amira. Oh, sorry, no, sorry. The one-state solution.
Yeah.
The one-state solution. As does Uriadri, people unquestioned.
We're talking about one state?
So BBS.
They're all, the 3 I mentioned are all opposing a one-state solution. But the reason given by Norman Finkelstein to the answer to my question is that it's a colored way of attacking Israel and removing the possibility of the Jewish state of Israel. And he's therefore declared it a furtive underhand way of attempting to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. My personal view is that won't exist in the future for reasons that we want to about. I'm interested in your view as to whether that's a valid reason.
Nothing Norman talks about the Jewish state of Israel. He talks about Israel, not Jewish state of Israel.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll get the panelists to respond to them, and then we'll have to move on to the
I just like to ask one question, which is related to what Mr. Solomon was saying, that in Gaza, there's a lot of pro-Israeli undermines that argument that gives the terrorists time to get away, and meanwhile then you just bomb the hell out of the building.
They're wanting for the civilians to get out, but in the process, the terrorists get out with the civilians. So they're not killing the right people, often is the case. So the bottom line is they're warning civilians. That's the object, and he knows.
I rest my case.
Peter knows they want civilians to get out.
I rest my case.
But when they get the message that the drugs go down.
You have the questions that it's up to the panelists to respond to the question from the floor. If you have one more question up the back.
She turns around and talks to me.
I'm sorry.
So my question to the panel was just around, so you spoke about the totalitarianism in Israeli society, and I was really shocked to see the other day images of people in Tel Aviv, which is supposed to be a progressive secular city, 2,000 of them protesting and saying death to the Arabs, and I just wonder how we might get to a situation where we can dismantle this sort of thinking, where we can dismantle the totalitarian nature of the Israeli state and build some kind of progress on that, because at this point in time, even if there was a massive change in international opinion on Israel, how do we cure the psychopathology that is inflicted upon citizens of Israel?
I'll go first. I have to say, I'm trying to remember what the first question was.
Procedural point. Could you please repeat the question that you were answering? Because most of us did not hear the question.
I think the first one was by Amira, if I'm correct.
Yes.
And it was, is the boycott, the economic boycott, only supposed to cause an inconvenience?
You mentioned.
I said it would only cause an inconvenience. And the context of that was that academic boycotts infringe on the Israeli academics' freedom to do research, really, and to do their work. No, it's not only supposed to cause them an inconvenience. The academic boycotts try to do, first of all, the boycott movement in general tries to do a few things. One of them is to raise awareness and get a conversation going where once we didn't have that conversation. So before we used to only talk about Palestine, Israel when many people died. Sabra and Shatila, Jenin, but the boycotts has made it more of an issue that we can talk about and discuss. So it's about raising awareness and having a debate. And it doesn't matter who shows up to this debate, all voices are good to hear because we need to be making informed decisions, so we need to hear each other. So it's about having debate, raising awareness. It is about putting pressure on Israeli institutions through the Israeli academics who are inconvenienced. We do want the Israeli institutions, the academic institutions, to start issuing stronger statements, to start talking about the lack of academic freedom that is afforded to the Palestinian people who live under their control. We're not talking about a different country. We're talking about a population that lives under Israel's control. I think the other question was about, have I answered?
There is, so far, it's more symbolic than the declarations that...
It is more symbolic, but you know what? When Stephen Hawking did not go to that conference in Tel Aviv, that really went beyond symbolism. That became an issue that made it to all the major newspapers. Everybody was talking about it, and in the context of talking about the boycotts, they were talking about the lack of academic freedom that the Palestinians have, the oppression that the Palestinians face. So it actually, it goes beyond the symbolic in so many ways. And the more we raise awareness around this issue, the more we're talking about it, the more we're likely to crack open that debate that needs to be had, which we're having in places like here today.
I was going to pick up your question to me, which follows on in a way from that. You asked to repeat the question, was how do I expect people to react against the superpower now as they did then? The only answer I've got is, again, the Rebbe, Chomsky, he points out some interesting stuff.
I'm sitting with Chomsky today.
I can't help it, but look, his answer is the following. I'm quoting him, but it sounds plausible to me. He said, first, it took a very long time for resistance against the Vietnam War to happen in America. He said he was feeling guilty. He only started to talk about it in the mid-60s. It took a long time, but it made a difference, he said, in the long run. The big demonstrations in the Boston Common and elsewhere. He puts it this way, that it saved some lives in Vietnam. I mean, it didn't stop the superpower, you know, killing up to maybe 4 million people. But the other thing that is relevant to this is a lot of the right wing, the hawks, complained that they lost the war at home. And they were right. I mean, so if that's evidence that it makes a difference, but we're weak, we won't have the power of
But they lost because they were many casualties.
that's the part.
Casualties.
Yes, but you know what's interesting? Chomsky points out a very interesting contrast. It's true, the most liberal end, in the American sense, of the spectrum, they said it's costing too much. Maybe too many American lives, maybe even too many Vietnamese lives. That was a secondary consideration, or too much money. But if you surveyed the general public, they said it was immoral. And they didn't hear it. They didn't, the most dovish end of the spectrum didn't speak that way. So they, in their heart, felt the moral outrage. And in the end, I think that upswelled. Look, frankly, I don't have a better answer than that. But what else can we do? There was a totalitarian mindset.
Israeli society,
The totalitarian mindset in Israel. Yeah. Look, let me be precise about the words. Israel is not a totalitarian society inside, nor is this. Chomsky's point is that when I use that word, he uses the word, it's a totalitarian mindset. An example of that is that you don't tolerate even the smallest dissent from the mainstream orthodoxy. Look at, you know, somebody, Amira appears on the radio, I don't know if they've already got somebody to oppose her, but when Ilan Pape was here, he talked for 20 minutes on the ABC, immediately they got Ilan, what's his name, Benny Morris to come. And they don't allow talks to go unless there's balance. You know, this symposium was already criticised before it started because it wasn't balanced. You know, they have the monopoly on the other side, and so that's a totalitarian mindset. So it's the mindset, not the society. That's what Chomsky's concerned with. In this liberal society, where we've got freedom, people have this sense that we can't hear dissent. And it's the dissent that's the crucial thing.
I believe the next question was that the BDS has one of its demands being the right of return, and that is why Finkelstein, is that what you were saying? Finkelstein opposes the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions movement because of that particular end. So for those who don't know, the BDS has three demands. One of them is to end the occupation. The other one is full equality for Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel. And the third is the right of return for Palestinians as per Resolution 194. I think it's very disingenuous to say that you support the Palestinian cause and in the same breath say that you do not want to put forward the rights of the Palestinian refugees. I would advise everybody to read an article by Ramzi Baroud, which moved me to tears a few days ago. It's called Stuck in Area A. And he talks in it about how the Oslo peace process and the Israeli and American dictated through the peace process the Palestinian mindset so that we've become so fragmented. So when we talk about Palestinian rights and Palestinian statehood and Palestinian ministries, everything is in Area A in Palestine. Meanwhile, in Yarmouk, in Syria, they are under siege. Their numbers have dwindled from 250,000 to 18,000. And they have no representation, no official representative to speak for them. And so what the BDS movement has done in those three demands, it is said, we all as Palestinians have these three issues that need to be addressed if we want to wrest this conflict and put it away forever so that we can have peace. We cannot have peace if we don't talk about one of these three issues: equality for the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and the right of return. Now, you know, the right of return is used as you know, I don't know how to say this, but I believe that a lot of liberal Zionists look at the right of return and they think immediately the destruction of Israel. But reality has shown, and statistics and figures and research has shown that it doesn't have to be so. That the numbers are overinflated, that there are places in Palestine and in 48 Israel that can accommodate the Palestinian refugees. Not all the refugees might want to return, but they have the right to make that decision. And we cannot forget about them. We just cannot do it, especially today, as so many of them are besieged in Yarmouk.
Their lives are not important enough to save them? You mean the lives of the people in Yarmouk are not important enough to try to save them?
I'm saying the opposite.
It seems to me that you're saying exactly what I'm saying. I'm sorry. Plain English.
Does anybody have any confusion?
Okay.
I want to talk about the leaflets, the flyers.
Yes.
Yes, very, very quickly. So, who was it?
That's right on the back, we're talking about, you know,
The flyers.
you asked a very specific question.
But just so you know, my family lives in the Stifle neighborhood in Gaza, which is the next neighborhood from Shujaiya. So when Shujaiya was getting absolutely destroyed, a lot of people were escaping on foot out of Shujaiya families, and they were going through Haifa Street, which is the main street in Tufah. And a few families stayed with my family. I have 2 uncles and several cousins who lived in a big family home that was once my grandfather's house. And what happened to these people is, I'll tell you about one particular story. The flyers were dropped in Tufah just while Shujaiya was getting plummeted. Flyers were dropped on the Tufah neighborhood. And so the families there had to make a decision. Do we leave the house because the IDF is telling us they're going to, destroy this area, or do we stay? They made the decision, most of them made the decision to actually stay because there was no place to leave to. By then, people from Tufah, people from all the outlying districts were actually moving into the city center. I could find some accommodation with other relatives that I had who lived in the middle, in the Rimal area. But people were all living together. But the reason they didn't want to leave is because no place was safe. So anyway, my cousin Lubna and her husband decided that they will leave. They will take that chance and they will go to Rimal, the only place that didn't have these flyers dropped. The next morning they woke up and a 1-ton bomb had been dropped on the high-rise building that they were in. And they made it alive by the grace of God, and they went back to Tufah. And you know why they went back? Because they said that we'd rather die in our home. This way, when they come and look at our corpses, they can recognize who we are. If we had died in Rimal, we would have been nameless, and nobody would have known who we are. So that is the reality, sir. No place was safe.
To their home, they wouldn't be bombed. The other gentleman, he asked a question.
Between them, the panelists have responded to all of the questions. Peter did actually respond to that question. I made sure of that. Yes, he did. But yeah, you can chat about it afterwards. That's fine.
Can I say one thing before I leave here?
Where do the Palestinians get the high-tech open shut?
Look, we just need to time. We need to move on to the next part of the event.
I ask a question before all these people just give me just 1 minute.
Would anyone else
They teach the children, Jews are the offspring of pigs and apes. Now that goes on from kindergarten.
I don't want to hear you anymore.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say.
We're going to pick it up.
I'm promising to keep this very quick. I'm just going to do a very short overview. I don't really need to summarise everybody's thoughts, it's impossible. But I have to say one thing. Before today's meeting, the Australian Jewish News ran a little story on us already, and I can't resist quoting to you a couple of remarks. And I'll mention the names, they're in here. This is Peter Wertheim, who's the director, I think, of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He said, the symposium has framed the conflict in a way that is intellectually superficial, morally simplistic, and utterly biased and lacking in credibility. That's yesterday, before he came. Fortunately, it's videoed, I think, and I have to say, this has been the most magnificent day. It's been a model of intellectual, academic decency and goodwill and deep, insightful discussions and well-informed discussions. I'm enormously impressed and I'm very privileged and grateful to have been here, and so I'm happy to get up and say this by way of summary. I have to pay tribute to the organisers. The students have done this. It's been heroic. It's in the best traditions of what a university should be doing, tackling a very controversial hot topic and conducting it as well as we've done. It couldn't be better, and it's a very dramatic disproof and refutation of the bullshit that's thrown around. Huh? Yeah. Knethen was better. Another quote, I have to read another quote. This is Dr. Hilton Immerman, honorary fellow at UNSW, he told the Jewish News, "This is a one-sided anti-Israel propaganda dressed up as an academic symposium. It only serves to discredit the straight university." But these are very revealing. It tells you the difficulty we face with the Israel lobby and the opposition to us. They're not being serious in engaging. There were serious efforts to invite them to come along. I'm glad that a couple of people have come along and we've had a robust debate. That's how it should be. And I think that's in the spirit. And I think this has proved how open and how genuinely people on the pro-Palestinian side are supporting human rights and decency and want to have a debate about it. So let me say just a couple of remarks about the things that were said. I won't try and summarise, as I say, Amira's talk. She was very eloquent and spoke enormously well. Above all for me, because I'm not in the field, it was an enormously informative day. I learned a lot. I felt like a student, and because it's not my area, it was enormously instructive to hear all of the stuff that was said. Amira gave us a very, very important insight into the difficulties that they're facing by being forced to be criminals. That's very interesting to hear, the extent to which the law... The other reason that's interesting is because one of the specific objections to today, I don't know if you could believe this, it was that the title of the symposium had the word occupation in it. The journalist of the Australian Jewish News called me to tell me that's why these leaders in the Jewish community didn't want to come today, because we used the word occupation. What the fuck do they think is going on over there? I mean, you know, the legal system, we've heard from Amira, the way the legal system is I don't have to explain, we've heard it. But this is trying, you can see my frustration with even dealing with opposition that is kind of deluded about what's going on over there. And it's the details of the horror that they're suffering on a daily basis that sums up. Amira used terms, the black hole of Israeli arbitrariness and cruelty, which he described as absurd and obscene. These are very appropriate moral condemnations. So that's the very great value of Amira's contribution. Just more or less at random, a couple other things. Ben saw, I learned a lot from the legalities, but there was a reaction that I had, there's one or two others in the group we had here. It's very disturbing if you're an activist and not a legal person. I mean, it was interesting to me because, there's my little notes on this, I have something else I was going to say. Doesn't matter. I need to get one of the papers or something. One of the things that had struck me about that was that Lisa, I think later on, said law is not rocket science. Well, I was pleased to hear that. But it also confirms the other term, the law is an ass. It tells you that, I mean, the problem is not being solved. That's why BDS and other movements are trying very hard to struggle with what the legal system is just not doing quickly enough or adequately enough. That's the sense I got from a very interesting account of. And one of the things that struck me particularly in that conversation, in his talk, was the fact that since 9/11, the countries around the world, I mean, the major powers have defined terrorism anything other than what the major states do. So if it's any kind of resistance, any kind of national liberation movement, they're by definition terrorism. Well, that's bullshit, but we know that's the way the rhetoric is coming out of the United States too. But that's very disturbing if this is now kind of illegal. I asked Ben, just in passing at lunch, what would have been the case when it's not in your own society, but let's say when America invaded Vietnam? It was killing the Vietnamese citizens. What does their resistance count as? Is that terrorism? I mean, they weren't the Vietnamese army, because the Vietnamese army was a puppet, you know, kind of client army of America. What about all the Vietnamese, the 4 million that got killed? Are they all terrorists and illegal, and their resistance is not? Now, if the law can't find a way to accommodate that, I need somebody to explain it to me. I have to do one other quick thing. The legal issue of universal jurisdiction was discussed, and I have a particular interest in this. Now, because I'm not a legal expert, there's a case study I can tell you in just 2 seconds. George Bush Sr. Was coming to Australia once, not long after the 1991 Gulf War. And I'm interested in the issues that were raised about how universal jurisdiction is now being used more, as I understood it, in relation to the crimes in Israel-Palestine. Back then, it's relevant to the legal questions that I had read the Ramsey Clark accounts of a war crimes tribunal, a bit like the Russell Tribunal. I don't know how many of you know. Hands up those who've heard of the Ramsey Clark War Crimes Tribunal on the first Gulf War. Well, it's a law place. I mean, when I asked a general audience, they've got no idea. What's interesting about that is that Ramsey Clark, by the way, was the former US Attorney General under President Johnson. So this is not Chomsky or some lefty radical you know, and they put on trial in absentia George Bush Sr., Colin Powell, Norman Schwarzkopf, and I don't know who else, high officials in the United States, and found them guilty of 19 counts of Nuremberg-style war crimes. Now, the reason that that's interesting for me as a layman, after the Pinochet case was mentioned as a model of the application of universal jurisdiction and other laws, when George Bush came to Australia, I thought we have to arrest him for war crimes. We've got all the evidence already collected in the documents from Ramsey Clark. So I didn't know how to do this. So I called up the law schools here at Sydney University, and I talked to the most senior, this was a while ago, so nobody need feel too guilty. I couldn't get a straight answer. At first they thought that I was interested in pursuing, I didn't reveal who I was chasing, they thought it was an Indonesian general, because I was involved with the East Timorese resistance here a little bit, and the activists. And then they were willing to talk to me. The moment I mentioned it was George Bush, one of them said, that's outrageous and it brings the law into disrepute. As if George Bush is such a saint that it couldn't be possible for him to commit a crime. Now, I couldn't get a straight answer from senior legal people about how one would go about. They didn't want to talk about it. So I find this experience interesting in relation to some of the things that were said today. Look, I probably ought not to try to say too much more in the way of summaries. They were wonderful discussions, and I wish I could go back and ask many more questions of all of them. The other thing I found interesting was the question of targeted killings that was discussed. That was by, I think it was Lisa Hudger. It was very interesting for me to hear the way in which this lawfare is being fought out on both sides of that fence. Look, I better not just bumble around. I just want to conclude by congratulating and thanking everybody for a wonderful day. Perhaps we can thank the organisers and all the speakers. Thank you.